Located at the end of St Georges Terrace, on the corner of Malcolm and Elder Streets and, the Mitchell Freeway, you'll find the Barracks Arch. That last road largely contributes to its current identity. A major landmark in Perth, prominently situated at the end of the city's busiest road for business, it was originally known as the Pensioners' Barracks. It was a much larger structure before the freeway, but we're lucky even the arch survives. There were those who wished it would also be at the receiving end of a wrecking ball. Historical societies and the general public fought against the government wanting it gone, in favour of a nice view down St Georges Terrace. The story of its existence nearly spans the entire history of Perth. It was important to the early settlers in the 1860s and was a symbol of people power in the 1960s. Let us explore why this was built and why only an arch remains today. Perth was originally formed as a free settlers colony in 1829, but had a rough start marred with failed crops, lacking infrastructure, labour shortages and a bad economy. The population had halved by the mid-1830s, not helped by a depression in the 1840s that soon followed. The idea of convict transportation began to sprout up in the late 1840s to address the labour shortages, but this was not popular with the locals. Perth as a colony prided itself on not using convict labour like everywhere else, and despite its shortcomings, was perceived as being safer for doing so. Still, Perth was falling behind because of its choice to not use free prison labour. As a compromise, a local rule was decided in 1848, in which the British government agreed that for every convict transported, a free settler must also immigrate. This was to stop the majority population becoming convicts. If old mate was brought over for, say, the heinous crime of stealing a loaf of bread, there would also need to be a free settler to match them. The pensioner guards were sent to help address that concern and also guard them on the ship. The first transportation vessel, the Cindian, carried the first 75 convicts and 55 pensioner guards on the 1st of June 1850. This included an additional 29 wives and 79 children. 42 similar ships would continue to arrive until 1868, but by then it was obvious that the original rule hadn't been followed. When the state ceased transportation, the convicts outnumbered the free settlers by about 2,400. Thousands of convicts and pensioners travelled to Perth during transportation. Many pensioners formed what was known as the Enrolled Pensioner Force, also known as the Pensioner Guards. These were retired or injured British soldiers. They were called pensioners because they were on a military pension, although they weren't pensioners like the modern usage of the word. Instead, many were under the age of 40 as they had joined the military as teenagers. The guards were required to complete 6 months of service, including the voyage time, but they were also required to be on call afterwards to keep the peace if needed and parade 12 days a year. While serving, they wore grey uniforms with a red stripe down the leg, coupled with a blue coat that became quite a common sight around Perth. After 7 years of service, they were supplied with land, given £10 and could use convict labour if needed. Many settled in the Greenock area, just south of Geraldton. That will be the basis of a future video. While many of the guards stayed in the colony having full careers in the police force or similar, on the other hand, many also abandoned their posts and their families immediately after arriving. The population of Perth was back to about 1,700 in the 1860s, 9,700 of which were convicts. As a prison labour force, they constructed much of the early infrastructure and original government buildings. The British military had been present since the colony's formation in 1829, but were recalled in 1862 in favour of the pensioners. By 1864, 2,000 pensioners had travelled to Perth, mostly from Ireland. There was an earlier barracks in Fremantle built in 1853, close to the modern-day markets. And in Perth, the original barracks were, you would never believe it, on Barrack Street. The location quickly became too small, however. A replacement was organised by the Chief Secretary of the States for the Colonies. £6,710 was paid out jointly by Imperial Military and Colonial Government funds, and locations were scouted. An original location considered was just behind the boys' school, but the site at the end of St Georges Terrace was ultimately chosen as it was vacant land, but also because of its commanding position over Old Perth Town. They were the authoritative figures at the time after all, and they wanted their presence felt. The structure was designed in the Tudor style by Richard Roach Jewell and built between 1863 and 1866. Jewell was responsible for a lot of construction in that time. Check out my video about Perth's oldest buildings for more information. The original building was designed to be 2 stories, but this eventually became 3. There was also a magazine, barrack square, parade ground, and 6 cells for drunks. It would become one of the largest buildings in the state. A quarry was opened near the top of Mount Eliza, in modern-day Kings Park, and convicts began quarrying stone for construction. I believe the quarried stone was for the foundation, as the rest of the building used brick for cost reasons. James Britton was responsible for that, and his brickworks were located in the modern-day Queen's Gardens in East Perth. The kilns were where the lily ponds are now. Alex Holliday was the carpenter. When he created his quote for construction, he estimated one wing, intending to double whatever that cost was. But unfortunately for him, he forgot to do that, quoting only half. The authorities, showing no sympathy, held firm on his contract, meaning he had to build the second wing at his own cost. The poor bloke actually went bankrupt because of this and lost his property. As a silver lining, the family received their property back 20 years later. It appears the government never formally transferred the title of the property, only remortgaging it. Eventually, all the debt was paid off through years of rent. You'd think the authorities would have had some leeway with costs since they used free convict labour for the construction, but I guess not. Either way, the building process was slow because of the time it took to create the bricks. And then once the brickwork was complete, they had to locate 30,000 shingles to construct the roof. Not an easy task in 1860s Perth. Once complete, there was a clock situated above the archway. By all accounts, this was quite large, being 4 foot high, although it looks a bit smaller in this photo. The bells for that also doubled as a fire alarm. While it was a large and imposing building, it also included the best views of the city at the time. This resulted in a few fantastic photos of Perth in the late 1860s and early 1870s. There were 120 rooms on completion in 1866, but only a portion of the 600 enrolled men initially moved in. They consisted of 50 married men and their families, along with an additional 20 single men. Each family apartment had 2 rooms, which were about 3 by 4 by 4 meters wide, although the design of the building did mean a few rooms were oddly shaped. Each apartment did have a fireplace, however, and were even fully furnished. Not sure how they all fit, but some apartments included up to 10 children. Outbuildings included facilities for washing, cooking, stables, and of course, a firing range. Married pensioners were also given basic rations that included meat, sugar, tea and flour. There were strict rules living in the barracks, however. Lights out was 10 PM. You also weren't allowed to leave any items on the veranda, furniture included. Otherwise, you'd be flogged. I'd imagine that would be a difficult rule to follow if you were managing a room full of kids. It appears the apartments eventually filled up, as the barracks were extended in 1873 to house 21 more families. The roof was also replaced with congregated iron. It even had a fives court added at this time, which was an early version of squash. This was not roofed and nicknamed Skittle Alley. Older pensioners also lived in a village near Leaderville that consisted of 2-roomed cottages. I've mentioned a similar village in my video about the Linton Convict Hiring Depot. You can also find the remains of another village around Lake Coogee. There was a rivalry between the children in the barracks, known as the Barrack Shiners, and the kids from the Leaderville village, who were known as the Swamp Shiners. Games of footy and cricket between them always ended in fights. It wasn't until 1878 that the British government handed full control of the barracks to the local authorities. However, the enrolled pensioner force was also disbanded that same year, as the need for them had waned since convict transportation halted a decade earlier. They weren't kicked out of the barracks at least. 50 of the best men were also retained for the formation of the new enrolled guard. This was essentially the same as the pensioner force, but on a smaller scale. 15 men were stationed in Perth, with 35 in Fremantle. In the December of 1887, there was a fire in the East Wing. Access to water to fight the fire was an issue, with multiple tanks and 3 wells running dry. Firefighters from Fremantle were asked to help, and amazingly, arrived by train only 46 minutes after being summoned. Several breweries began sending beer to the fire too, not to extinguish it, mind you, but for the volunteers fighting it. Thus, the word got out, and suddenly there were quite a few volunteers. The new manpower allowed them to pump and handcart water from the river. Thankfully, the wind eventually blew in their favour, and they were able to save the other wing. With the fire extinguished, the volunteers staggered home. Unfortunately, the clock could not be reinstalled. It was transferred to government stores in the belief that it only required minor repairs. However, in 1892, the authorities in Guildford applied to have it replace their town clock. It was found in pieces, badly aged, and with missing parts. It was not mentioned again. By 1887, the Enrolled Guard was also abolished and performed their final parade. The last convict transportation ship was in 1868, so I can't imagine there were too many active convicts around by the late 1880s. From 1878, the central portion of the barracks was used as a school. This would eventually become Hale. The school lasted there until the mid-1880s, and a police station was established in its place. One wing was occupied by the police and their families, while the other, the remnants of the enrolled pensioner force. In the State Library, I found their regulations for living there during this time. The apartments were to be kept perfectly clean, and nothing was allowed to be thrown out the window. Slop is specifically mentioned. Keep your slop indoors. You also weren't allowed to swear, be drunk, or have guests over. Number 5 was the best. Whilst it is not desired to curtail innocent amusement, boisterous or unseemly conduct is prohibited in quarters. So, have fun, but not too much fun. The Public Works Department had become crowded in Cathedral Avenue by the late 1890s because of the enormous amount of gold discovery. Gradually, the workers moved into the barracks from 1900 to 1904 as they were converted into office space. The last remaining pensioners were moved out in 1904, with the Charities Department compensating their moves and providing weekly allowances. The last pensioner to die was Daniel Corty in 1922. He was 90 years old. The last widow died in 1932, aged 86, but the final person to die who was born in the barracks, all the way back in 1869, passed away in 1950. C.Y. O'Connor was a prominent occupant, with his office directly above the existing arch. With O'Connor in the office at this time, many of WA's most important infrastructure was planned. This included the pipeline to Kalgoorlie, the Port of Fremantle, and the Hills Water Supply Scheme, which are all highly requested videos. Don't worry, I'll get to them. Despite another fire in 1938, which was this time brought under control without the aid of beer, the offices continued to expand. The Fives Court was converted into a drawing office, and there were extensions in the 1920s for the Metropolitan Water Supply, Sewerage and Drainage Department. Other expansions came in the form of temporary buildings in the courtyard, but space continued to run out, and everyone moved to the newly built Dumas House in 1966. I want to quickly interject by announcing my new channel, Brendan Goes Outside. This will primarily include hiking and camping, but also plenty of history and other stories relating to the locations. It's my goal to make walking through the bush as entertaining as possible. Please find it linked in the description, there's 3 videos out so far. I'm hoping to reach 1,000 subscribers by the year's end. Thank you so much for listening, and let's now return to the story of the Barracks Arch. Back in 1953, the government invited Gordon Stephenson, an English town planner and architect, to prepare the plan for the metropolitan region, Perth and Fremantle. This was also known as the Stephenson or Stephenson-Hepburn Report. This was the first regional plan of its kind in Western Australia. At the time, the Perth and Fremantle city centres were suffering from bad congestion. Immediately, the barracks were on the chopping block. To quote Stephenson, "A completed Parliament House with a terraced approach would be a magnificent and appropriate climax to St Georges Terrace. The old barracks and the temporary buildings below Parliament House should be removed." Suffice to say, he didn't have any love for the barracks like a local might, but he's the one with a big building named after him. And those in Parliament House, which at the time were the Liberal Brand government, wished for a clear view directly down St Georges Terrace, especially as the eastern wing was under construction during this time. They wanted that same commanding position over the city, which was the reason the barracks was built there in the first place. Removing the barracks wasn't a new idea as far as Parliament was concerned. All the way back in 1901, just before Parliament House was first constructed in that location, demolition became a hot political issue. The issue was probed by a select committee of the Legislative Assembly, and quote, "It was decided that the barracks should not be pulled down immediately, but should be left temporarily until such time as Parliament House was complete, and the people could then decide." I doubt they thought it would take 60 years. To make his point clear, Stephenson goes on to refer to the barracks as an inadequate and obsolete office building, further stating that it is not a building of distinction or architectural merit. Well, it appeared many at the time disagreed. Somewhere in that time, the freeway was announced, and talks began about at least retaining the arch. It first hit the press December 1959. Writers for the West wondered if the arch would look weird standing by itself, and if it should be moved to a new location entirely, like Kings Park. The Barracks Defence Council was formed October 1961. This was comprised of representatives from the National Trust, the Royal Western Australian Historical Society, and a list of other organisations who, ideally, wanted to save the entire structure. They argued that the freeway would run behind, not through the complex, and that a planned minor loop road through the site could easily be redirected. Their plan was to fight to keep the arch and 5 bays of windows either side at best, or just the gateway and tower at worst. In early 1963, the Defence Council urged Premier Brand to wait and trial retaining the structure for 5 years. Brand said he would give the situation a second look in 1966, which the council found to be too vague of a reply. There's a pamphlet you can read online, originally written by the Defence Council. I also viewed one of the original copies in the State Library. It details the reasoning for retaining the barracks, going into the situation and its history. I like how it ends. In bold capital letters, it says, "Remember, public opinion and private enterprise saved the old mill." No doubt the South Perth mill would also make for an excellent video subject. But despite the Defence Council's early efforts, the wings were demolished March 1966. Brand claimed retaining the wings would blow out the cost of the freeway beyond all reason. He's further quoted as saying, "We felt the fairest way to decide would be to let it stand after the wings are gone so that the government and public can form a final opinion." The sight of the wrecking ball at least invigorated public interest, and debate began about retaining the arch. 6IX ran a poll in 1966 asking if the arch should be retained or not, with an astounding result of over 2,700 votes to retain and just 59 votes to demolish. I guess they must have been politicians. Soon after, the government offered to pay half of the cost to move the arch elsewhere, which would cost about $60,000, with the other $30,000 raised by public subscription. But they also had no location in mind and wouldn't take responsibility for the work. The cost being shared by the people was seen as laughable, since this was a problem created by the government in the first place. The bricks were also considered too brittle for reconstruction anyway. As you can imagine, the Defence Council rejected the proposal. The West Australian then ran its own poll. The results were over 9,600 to keep and about 1,300 to demolish. Channel 7 also commissioned McNair Surveys to run a poll. They asked 282 people across Perth, which admittedly seems a bit small. But the results of that poll were 43% to keep, 32% to demolish, and 25% no opinion. The results were aired on TV, and in response, Brand, quote, "The McNair results did not indicate a decision one way or the other," finishing with, "The public presumably was leaving a decision to the authorities." Maybe he wasn't good at math? The Cabinet ran a Gallup poll several days later, the results of which was 49% to keep, 35% to demolish, 11% for didn't care, and 5% to move the arch elsewhere. Brand was quoted as calling the results indecisive, which is a rather strange thing to say. They, and the results before it, seem pretty clear-cut to me. When interviewed about the results, Brand was steadfast on his decision of demolition and is quoted as saying, if people disagreed with it, they could express their opinion at the 1968 election. He appeared to be stalling as public sentiment turned against him. So, he decided that Parliament would vote on a non-party basis. He wasn't vague about his desired outcome either. He initiated a motion in the Assembly, which read, that in the opinion of this House, the Barracks Archway should be removed so that Parliament House and its surroundings can become the focal point of the western end of St Georges Terrace. The Defence Council began a publicity campaign that included posters, badges and bumper stickers. They proclaimed, "Don't be bulldozed, save the arch." The phone directory had the arch on its cover that year too. That may have just been a coincidence, but it certainly helped. The debate and vote were heated, with the then opposition leader, Bert Hawke, who was Bob Hawke's uncle, stating, the government had brought this motion to Parliament because the public opinion test poll did not produce the result which the Premier and his colleagues thought it would produce and hoped it would produce. Brand retorted with, I have made tactical mistakes about this matter, but only in the interest of the people. Those people obviously being his fellow politicians who wanted a better view. Thankfully, the motion for demolition was defeated 26 to 18, which included members crossing the floor. Defeated, but still defiant, Brand declared that the arch would remain until the freeway was at least completed. What followed were several suspicious fires, the first in November 1966. Someone had doused the staircase in petrol and constructed a fuse comprised of a sardine tin and a 3-inch candle set in cotton wool. We can thank two men for saving the arch, Peter Serventi and Robin Folds, who saw what was happening and halted the petrol from being set alight. And then several months later, in January 1967, two youths sprayed kerosene into the south turret and set it alight. Thankfully, the fire was quickly extinguished, but not before one of the arsonists badly hurt themselves. Finally, in March 1968, the government formally announced that the arch would be retained for good. It would form part of a beautification scheme, with gardens running along the soon-to-be-finished Mitchell Freeway. However, the plan was nearly hampered in the following August by a Labour member named Harry Fletcher. He claimed the arch looked like a lavatory in the desert and wanted it moved to the start of Barrack Street. This was probably an unfair assessment since restoration work was yet to begin. There was again a free vote before the House, which Fletcher lost 32 to 14. Brand then announced afterwards that restoration works would begin immediately. It was partially reconstructed on the freeway-facing side, with restoration costing between $20,000 to $25,000. Bricks from the earlier demolition were reused and artificially aged to blend in. The remaining floors were also reinforced with concrete, with the surrounding area landscaped. It would be pertinent to point out that the arch suffered no damage during the Meckering earthquake several months later. There were those who thought it couldn't survive a tremor as just an arch. Parliament House, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. That suffered damage to several rooms. Decades later, the arch still proudly stands in its original spot. I was lucky enough to go inside and film the interior several months ago. Admittedly, there isn't too much to see, but there's a grand staircase and the history of the structure is meaningful. Not every day you get to gaze out of the same window as C.Y. O'Connor, although his view would have been quite different 120 years ago. This was after an organised tour by the city of Perth. While tours of the arch aren't a regular occurrence, it was run by a volunteer group called iCity. I'll link their page in the description as they offer free walking tours around the Perth CBD and are well worth checking out. You can also email them at hello@visitperth.com. Special thanks goes to Linda for being a wonderful and knowledgeable tour guide, but also for hanging around afterwards and letting me film. I also want to thank Susanna from the City of Perth for reaching out and facilitating the filming session in the first place. In my research, I found a quote on a Museum of Perth article from the Canberra Times in 1966 that sums up the story nicely. Quote, "Perth's old Barracks Archway has become, for its defenders, the West Coast Arc de Triomphe. For weeks it has teetered forlorn in what seems to be its last days on the brink of the chasm that will contain the Mitchell Freeway. Now it stands as a symbol for the victory of sentiment over aesthetics and history over progress." The campaign to stop the demolition kickstarted others when it was apparent that it was possible. There were many great buildings lost to redevelopment during this period, which will be covered in a future video. It showed that people valued these old buildings. And now, for the most part, what's left are preserved through laws like heritage listings. And now when politicians gaze eastward from Parliament House, they don't see straight down St Georges Terrace like their 1960s counterparts wanted. Instead, they see the arch. A reminder that not everything necessarily needs to be wiped for progress. This channel is supported by a YouTube membership program where there's quite a few behind the scenes videos. They include travel vlogs where I head out to film, some of which last multiple nights and I travel quite far. Others are a bit closer to home and usually involve overnight camping, the antics of which are included in the vlogs. I'll also generally visit locations that I find interesting around their local areas but aren't involved enough for full proper videos. The camping is thanks to a sleeping platform I built in my Forester. I also have a video where I build that. Otherwise, there's several recon missions I've brought the viewers along on, some on foot, others on bike. There's also a range of other behind the scenes videos that show how the gravy is made. The support program is just $3 a month and can be cancelled at any time. That $3 includes the extra content, shows your username at the end of the videos, and highlights any comments you might make. All money earned goes back into the production of future videos. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.